Welcome to Men, Sex, and Tantra.
Discover what your parents, porn, and religion never taught you about being a man and having extraordinary sex. I'm Tanya.
And my name is Robert Schwenkler.
And get ready to have your mind blown and your world rocked.
Today's subject is, well, Tanya, this is your subject, so why don't you introduce it?
What you sex and baby ducks have in common. You're thinking, what the actual fuck, Tanya? That sounds wrong. And that comes from the fact that yesterday I was involved or instigated a baby duck, mama and baby duck rescue. Mama and 9 baby ducks wandering around in the middle of an urban, suburban kind of experience that were going to die unless they were actually caught and moved. But that reminds me, because I was talking about how fragile and soft and fuzzy those little tiny babies were and how easy they were to catch and how sad that was because they're so vulnerable, led us into this topic of sexual trauma.
Yeah, so on a completely related note to baby ducks.
is trauma, and then there's sexual trauma. So, this is the weird inner workings of my brain.
Yeah. And so, yeah, the high level context, and Tanya and I were both highly in agreement with this for this conversation around male sexual trauma, is that most men don't identify as having experienced it.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the word trauma for a moment. Most people, in my experience, think that trauma is some kind of overt, big,
violence,
violent moment, or even if it's not in the context of sexual trauma, like a car crash or some kind of overt, big thing that happens in one moment. And that obviously is true. What's more true in a lot of ways is that trauma for many, I don't even know, maybe most people, shows up as kind of small occurrences that happen over time.
It can be covert, it could be subconscious, like just programming that's kind of fed in, like even the word like stupid. If you're called stupid over and over again as you're growing up, that creates neural pathways in your brain that actually identify with that, and then we'll start to try to make your story fit what you believe is true. That's some weird stuff that our neural pathways and our psychology does to us that's not very beneficial. So trauma can be insidious. Is that the right word? No,
insidious.
Yeah, insidious. I'm like, insidious? What kind of word is that? That's me making up language. And not as blatant as you might say, with another way to say that. Kind of mansplain that for me, please.
Yeah. Let me just go ahead and mansplain that for you. Well, what I want to say is that kind of a basic working definition of trauma that I could offer is any place where you were disconnected from your humanity, from the feelings, emotions, energies inside of your body. That's one way to, as a kind of a blanket statement. And has everybody had that experience? Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say, who hasn't had some type of experience? What I think of it is a contraction that doesn't allow for expansion immediately. So it would be, flight, freeze, fight kind of response in your nervous system where you shut down, get angry, or run away, one of those things. And what happens is, instead of coming back to homeostasis, you actually contract down on that and create a memory in your cells, as well as your chemistry changes. So that's how I look at it from that biological sense.
So sexual trauma, there's, again, as we were speaking about, there is obviously the overt kind of sexual trauma that a lot of men, I think far more men, experience overt sexual trauma than is generally acknowledged or accepted.
Right.
And what I want to speak about before we go into that particular conversation is just the trauma of male socialization. There are so many conflicting pieces that men get all throughout their lives. Number one, here's an overt one that a lot of our culture is still pretty dissociated from, actually, though: circumcision. Baby boy comes out of the womb, his dick gets cut up. at like a super early age. I was looking up numbers on this just the other day. The numbers in the US are super high, like 80% or something like this.
You know what's sad too about that?
What's
And
that?
that can be an entirely other podcast topic, is that the reasons are typically because somebody wants their son to look like the father, or the mother has never been with an
It's an
uncircumcised.
aesthetic.
Yeah, and it's aesthetic. It's like, and the stupid archaic notion that the baby doesn't feel any pain at that age is like so outdated, ridiculous, and
And the opposite is true. Like
right,
babies are so sent, their
right,
systems feel everything.
yeah.
Yeah.
Don't
Eh,
circumcise your babies.
yeah. And sexual trauma happens in uh, cultures where there isn't circumcision, but like this is a pretty acute, overt, obvious example that a lot of our culture still hasn't made the connection around. And then as a boy growing up, you're taught, a lot of us, many of us, maybe most, get the message that on one hand, what it means to be a man is to be hypersexual, to want to be smooth, confident, to want to be able to fuck
Rock
all the time, to
everything.
have a hard dick.
Right.
Yeah. And then on the other side, almost seemingly completely contrasting that is this opposing message, especially in today's age of male sexuality is harmful. You need to learn how to control it. You even need to completely hide it and never do it in a moment where you might hurt or even make uncomfortable a woman. And so these are just a few of the ways that men get socialized that I qualify as trauma that absolutely show up in the level of the level of sexual, I want to say, power and confidence that a man can bring, but also B, the level of intimacy that a man is able to access through sexual engagement.
Yeah. And then the wounds that good men take on for a few of the bad guys, the dudes that do harm to other people, that's another sexual trauma that good men seem to take on,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
feeling guilty for their gender.
Yeah, which falls in that latter category there of like, don't be the harmful man, basically.
Exactly. And then the things that when I work with men that have come up that, you know, frequently men even brush under the rug as not sexual trauma. I mean, obviously we have the molestation, which is sexual trauma, but the being in a power dynamic with a kid that's like 5 or 6 years older than you are, that has been sexually traumatized, that then lures you into a game that might actually be arousing at the time, because it's normal for kids to play doctor, it's normal for kids to investigate, it's normal for boys to masturbate with somebody else. These things would all be across the norm. But if there's a power dynamic in there because somebody else has been abused and now they're pushing those boundaries, it might not seem at the time like abuse because it could be arousing, but this is where arousal and anxiety get tied together. It's one of the most difficult things to unwind, is anxiety and arousal tied together through molestation, abuse at an early age that doesn't even seem like it at the time, that you may not even recognize it. Another one that men have said that they kind of go, oh yeah, no big deal. The babysitter, uh, you know, is grooming them, or the babysitter is like, hey, let's play this game, or the babysitter does something, and most boys are like, yeah, it was so cool because older woman, that's what I'm supposed to want, and all that, without understanding that that was traumatizing, that they were nervous, that that was uncomfortable, that they felt guilty afterwards, that these things were not okay. I have a client who, his uncle and his uncle's girlfriend used to take him to bed when he was 10, telling him like this was a great deal because he was learning about sex and sexuality. Obviously, that's sexual trauma, even though he wasn't pushed or raped in a violent way. Definitely. Another example is a client whose family was hypersexualized, and whenever anybody had a bad day, the family said, go masturbate.
Mm.
And so it was like, oh, you're having tension and whatever, go masturbate. It was hypersexualized at a really early age when it was confusing and produced habits that weren't all that great. Uh, some girl takes her clothes off and forces you to take your clothes off, even though it's titillating, it's still anxiety producing. So all the way up. So there's a lot and lots of pieces. And most men never, ever, ever, especially if it was another male that they had an encounter with, speak about it. I mean, the numbers are so tiny about
Yep.
how many men will speak about that.
And for me, listening to this, all of this really continues to fit back into this piece around male socialization again. Um, my mind is going like three different directions at once. I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent from what you're talking about, but related. You're talking about experiences of younger boys and maybe an older, younger boy and how that can be traumatizing. Um, I've been at, there was one men's retreat conference that I was at in 2014, about 100 men in the room, all gathered in big circle. And might have been me who stepped out in the center of the circle. And it was basically like, who else, a who else exercise. Big circle, one guy steps in the middle, shares something, and it's every guy who resonates, raises his hand or steps in a little bit. And the prompt was, my first sexual experiences were with other boys. And I thought that that would be the minority of men, where in reality, that was the majority of men in the room.
Yeah.
So even if the sexual experience is more in the consensual realm and it really is just a genuine playfulness, there still is this messaging as men that that's not okay, that's not good, when the reality is that the majority of men, and I've heard other men validate this experience outside of my experience in a room of 100 men, and so this way that we get socialized and trained out of just what is, this happens to be a normal thing for boys to do. You add actual trauma on top of that,
Right.
and there's already this layer of, you need to keep this secret, this is not okay. You add actual trauma on top of that, it only kind of multiplies the trauma that is taking place inside of the boy's body.
Yeah. And even first time sexual encounters with the gender that you're attracted to can be traumatizing. And in a way and once again, titillating and traumatizing tied together, anxiety and arousal tied together, which leads to behaviors later that can create being what most men think of as premature ejaculation, because anxiety already creates the go for the ejaculation moment a lot quicker. But just also in the holding back, in the hiding, in the shame, and the disconnect. So you had said that in the beginning. So what most of the men that I've worked with, and we're talking thousands here, do is disconnect that experience. So what that does when you disconnect from your sexuality or from that disassociate and disconnect from that experience that happened, is you don't inhabit your body. You actually literally check out of your body. So now you need huge experiences to feel anything. And so you might be having sex where you have to create such a intense feeling around your penis to feel anything, that you're just that checked out, that sex isn't even really that satisfying, and you use it as a medication tool, the ejaculation as a medication tool to calm down.
Well, yeah. And I mean, highly stimulating experiences to get you to feel something that's, for tons and tons of men, that's read as, I'm going to look at sensationalized porn, jack off, come,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
train my nervous system that way, in addition to obviously actual sexual experiences. And then on the other side of the polarity, there's the guys who are so overwhelmed by it all that they are super shut down to actual sexual experiences.
Right. Yeah. So it's like, well, that's all scary and I'm not going there.
Yep.
Or I'm only going there with sex workers because that's a sure thing. That's a safe thing. I know what's going to happen there. And have taken all this other pieces out of the equation. Or just like you said, porn, like forget sex. I'm just using porn and that's fine. But it sounds like a landmine for the rest of the stuff. When I started working with men in sexual healing, it was really so eye-opening that the amount of men, I could see the trauma in them, and it might take me a while to kind of lead them to the story that all of a sudden they recognized as this was the moment when things got freaking scary and I felt powerless. I was aroused but felt powerless. And a lot of these, people get mad at me when I say this, but the majority of men that want to submit in BDSM are triggering past traumas, and women too. But there's a lot of that past triggering that trauma that happens in that. And early sexualization does some really interesting thing to our sex lives. I'll say that. Now, that's not a total blanket. Don't everybody hate me now because it was, but I'm saying that my data is pretty conclusive around that. And when I start to think about, they start to talk about, oh yeah, that happened, and I'm recreating that kind of, I was out of control and anxious when this first experience happened.
Yep. And for me, as I take in this whole conversation, the gestalt of this conversation, one of the fundamental things that it comes down to is men's the male need, whether it's a boy or a man, need for safety, a sense of just a sense of safety. And they're from really early on, that's not afforded men, and women have it as well in their own distinct ways. And I think in today's culture, in my experience, it's a lot less acknowledged oftentimes that
Yeah,
men have just as deep, if not more of a need for safety in certain ways, but certainly I feel totally comfortable saying as deep of a need as safety as any woman,
absolutely.
but it's far less acknowledged that that's true.
Well, even by the man. I mean, that's the like, you
But
say,
because we had trained that way.
yeah, you say sex and safety to a man, they're looking at you like, what are you even talking about?
Yeah.
I'm dangerous. Sex is dangerous. Everything's dangerous. It's like that kind of like, I got to come out from that experience. And um, we see with the work we do, plenty of men who are like, oh my gosh, yeah, hand in the air. If they really get vulnerable and what
Yeah.
they really want is that safe place, then excitement arousal is really different when it's not tied to anxiety. And I dare say that most people's arousal is tied in with anxiety because of early conditioning and childhood things that happen. And when you uncouple those two, which does take work, but when you uncouple those two, your arousal actually is way, way bigger, better, higher, and more satisfying. If you feel as a man that you have sex, but it's difficult to have love and sex coupled together, like when you love somebody, you find that you're less sexual with them. And when you're just banging, you're a lot more sexual. That right there is a clue that anxiety and arousal are tied together. Because when you love somebody and you settle down into that space of heartfelt openness, you start to feel safe, your arousal could tank. So if you find yourself loving and being intimate and then just being kind of like about sex, you find that you look for your best friend in a relationship that doesn't have a lot of passion to it. You haven't learned that sex and safety go hand in hand in a beautiful, beautiful way.
Yeah. And I would posit that for at least a good chunk of men who experience that kind of a dynamic, it's, you said you get into the relationship, you start to feel safe, but safety is an internal job. Ultimately, I've got to feel safe inside of my own body. So if I'm being put in a circumstance that is safe, where I'm starting to feel safe, but I'm kind of divided inside, and some part of me is still feeling unsafe, my capacity to go reconnect to the part that still feels unsafe, we're not really taught how to do that. We're not really, we don't have social environments where that's even really a conversation on the table, let alone a capacity that the people around us have cultivated, which all comes right back to the work that you and I do, is
Yeah.
creating those kinds of spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is funny to watch a man, you put a group of men, 150 men in a room, and they're all there to learn how to better sex. And you say something about safety and they all look like, are we in the wrong room? Like that's the first logical hit, right? Because sex, safety, men, those three words, like how often do they come up, like you said, in conversations that are common?
And especially for the guy, I think that one's a little bit more obvious for the guy who's in shame and overtly disconnected and feels fear around it. But for the guy who lives more on the hypersexual side of the realm, that's probably not even going to be on his radar at all.
Or the completely disconnected realm. So what would we say? So a man who's in more in his complete masculine would be more disconnected from that
Yep.
idea and that whole
Yep.
place, whereas a
Yep.
man who's more balanced, more leaning towards the feminine energy of balance would be heartfelt, looking for that. Know that might know that that's a feeling that they want to connect through their heart. In fact, some of those men don't get erect unless they're connected,
Yeah.
and
Well,
the
and
opposite.
that's just a whole other, like, the
Right.
a lot of men that I work with, again, like, need safety, need connection. That's a part of how
Yeah.
there's a spectrum of, of men and women. Some women are more oriented to be able to just do the physical thing, but on some level, everybody needs some level of safety and connection, at the very least, in order to experience some of the deeper, more beautiful, more powerful states of sexual engagement.
Doesn't mean you can't get off, but getting off can be like, I just
Yeah.
got off, versus holding the hands of God sex,
Yeah,
opening the
exactly.
universe sex, feeling transformed sex.
Yep.
Back to baby ducks. What? Those fuzzy little baby ducks. Sorry,
there,
they're on my mind.
there actually was she was like, fuzzy little baby ducks, so tender, so vulnerable, just like men.
Yeah, just like a man in his vulnerability, non-erect, beautiful, soft space that really needs that love and tenderness, because they shouldn't always feel like every time they're in near a woman they have to be erect and hard and performing.
Yeah.
And some of the work that I've done with men that I meet in that space have been so transformative for them, like the ability to be held in a soft space with no expectation, with no performance, with none of that, just revolutionize their feelings about all of that. So it's a beautiful space.
Men learn how to release the baby duck inside of you.
I know, right? Step into your baby duck.
Step into your baby duck.
All right, so we want to leave you with one is like, yeah, one be the baby duck, wax on, but one, like, take a little mental inventory of growing up, and see if there isn't something that all of a sudden stands out to you that maybe you have just not acknowledged, because it seems like stupid to acknowledge that shouldn't be a big deal. Everybody told you you were lucky that babysitter did something to you, or you got to touch the babysitter at it when you were 10 or 9, or somewhere in your teens where you maybe you even fumbled around with somebody and didn't get it right and you were ridiculed, right? And a story was told about you, or you were actually grabbed by an older man and molested, and that happens a lot,
Yep.
that
Yep.
we don't want to talk about. Anything like this, I mean, we can just go to the priesthood, right? And all the altar boys and all the problems with that whole thing that came out to light. Piano teachers, I've heard all the stories. So check back and take a moment and see if you can acknowledge or identify that, and then take a moment and just be quiet with yourself. And how does that feel in your body? Do you contract on that experience? Do you feel really tight when that happens? Is there any grief, sadness, anger that comes up? And how is it affecting, if you can take that journey, what's happening with you today? Because we can't heal what we can't accept.
Yep.
And just know that there is healing to be had around that.
Yeah. And if you feel safe enough to share a little bit in the comments. Let us know what came up for you as you listen to any part of this interview. And potentially, I know that there are men out there who feel solid enough in their story and their history, and they have made contact with these kinds of traumas, that they can share honestly and powerfully, and that can be powerful for other men to witness. There was, who I think it was Terry Crews a couple of years ago, came out and was sharing about his stories of sexual trauma as a child, like this super public, super masculine figure.
Yeah.
And it can be really powerful when men take the lead in that kind of way.
And if you don't want to share there, you can reach out to either one of us. We obviously we do this work. We help coach people through this type of thing, and we have programs as well for that. But just the main thing is to know that you're not alone. Absolutely not alone.
The
It's way
opposite of it, unfortunately.
more common than you'll ever think. In fact, I meet very few men that haven't had some type of sexual trauma, so it's more than not. And they don't come to me because that's the first in line. They come
Yeah.
to me because of other sexual dysfunctions and or connection problems, and then it's uncovered that here's some of the ground zero.
Well, the dysfunction in quotation marks,
Yeah, yeah,
because it's actually your body is working right.
yeah. It's telling you that something's wrong
Yeah.
and you need to address that. So, and anything around addictions and stuff like that, we frequently uncover that a lot of those are symptoms of something that is unresolved.
Yep. So thank you for being with us today. We will talk to you again really soon.